And now, my son, go thy way, declare the word with truth and soberness, that thou mayest bring souls unto repentance, that the great plan of mercy may have claim upon them.
Welcome to the podcast, Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. Your hosts for this show are Jason Hunter and Jeff Hicks.
Welcome, everybody, to Truth and Soberness. We're glad you could join us for another episode. Today, we're talking about Genesis 24 through 33. Will kind of be the foundation of the discussion that we have today. So we'll turn the mic right over to Jason and get started. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. We're kind of skipping down the generations now. We've been spending a lot of time with Abraham. The first couple chapters of Genesis take us through, Adam and Enoch and Noah, and we cover thousands of years of history in a very short period of time. And then we get to Abraham, and then it kind of slows down, and we spend several chapters on Abraham. In fact, a good dozen or more. And now we're starting to move on past Abraham and get into the origins of the house of Israel with Jacob. But what's kind of surprising to me is how little we know of Isaac. Whenever we are told about the three patriarchs, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we get a lot of Abraham. In fact, the extra canonical literature on Abraham is vast. And, he's the father of so many nations of people. And then we go to Isaac, and then we have Jacob. And, the whole rest of the Bible is concerned with Jacob and his posterity. And Jacob's new name, Israel, is just synonymous with the covenant people. Well, Isaac has so little mentioned about him. And it's always been kind of curious to me because he typifies the Savior in that sacrifice that we talked about last week of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. He inherited everything that his father had, the birthright, the priesthood, all go through him and then through Jacob. And so we know that he was a righteous person and a prophet in his own right, but there's not much written about him. And in fact, what we do have written about him, things are always happening to him. He's never, going out and doing this or doing that or choosing this or anything. It's, he was offered up as the sacrifice. And then when it comes time for him to marry, the servant goes out to find him a bride. And then when it comes to pass on the birthright to his sons, it's Rebecca that, does all of the manipulating of things and arrangements. Rachel. Is it Rachel or Rebecca? I suddenly had a brain skip right there.
Yeah, but Rachel. I believe Rachel.
Rachel. It is Rachel. Yeah, Leah and Rachel. And so all of these things are being done to him, and he kind of enters the narrative, and then he kind of quietly goes out as soon as Jacob and Esau come on scene. So I'm always curious about that. There's got to be more, but what that is, I don't know. And so we'll talk a lot about Jacob and Esau. But before we get to them, there's a part in Genesis 25, still dealing with Abraham, where he takes a wife. This is after Sarah has died. This wife's name is Keturah, and she has a son named Midian. And this is important because though the narrative is going to go through Isaac and Jacob and take us through the house of Israel, Midian is obviously a righteous heir of Abraham as well. We know this because they had the priesthood through them. When Jacob and his 12 sons go into Egypt, and Joseph is there second in command to Pharaoh. They've got the priesthood. They have covenant-keeping peoples with them. But down through the ages, it finally gets down to Moses, and there's no priesthood anymore among the children of Israel. They had all gone apostate. Well, when Moses goes out into the wilderness and finds his bride, she's the daughter of Jethro, who is a Midianite who comes through this line all the way back to Abraham. Well, Jethro is the one who bestows the Melchizedek priesthood on Moses. And so, though the Israel line had gone apostate long ago, the Midianite line seems to have been very well preserved and very righteous, and brought the priesthood back to the house of Israel. We also know that Ishmael, another son of Abraham's, had the priesthood, and it went through generations among those in Persia and other areas of the Middle East before it was eventually lost. But the priesthood isn't limited to the house of Israel. In fact, there have been righteous people throughout the ages that have had the priesthood, and it's just interesting that we kind of get this glimpse of it here with Midian. And honestly, we don't know how long they stayed faithful. How long past Moses? It's just, again, lost to the ages that we'll hopefully get some information on later. But just
Jason,
something interesting to think about.
it's always been interesting to me, and I know that it's come up in numerous discussions over the years, and that is the lines of authority and making sure that the priesthood lines are not corrupted, and that those who claim to have the priesthood have it through the proper lines. And I know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that has been a big deal throughout the years since the church was restored, making sure that priesthood line of authority is not broken, and in fact was restored to the earth when Joseph Smith was ordained to the priesthood and received that. And I think that it's absolutely necessary in these discussions to bring that up, because it is important to have the actual authority through the priesthood and the power to take care of certain ordinances on the earth. And you mentioned the children of Israel, well, in Egypt for those hundreds of years that they were there. It was corrupted and lost, and had to be restored in a way later on down the line. And I think that that's an important part of that discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you're going to be baptized, it's got to be by one that has authority, not and simply having good intentions or being well-meaning is not enough. If these are binding ordinances and covenants, they have to be done with a seal of approval, with that stamp of authority that the priesthood brings. And a lot of these genealogy or lines that we see in the Bible of A begat B and B begat C all the way down is one way of tracking that. It's keeping track of this priesthood line or this covenant keeping line through this particular family. And like you said, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we do something similar. Not only do we track our family histories, but we track the authority of the priesthood as it comes down to us. Very important things.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting to note that a similar thing occurred in the Book of Mormon. And we if we kind of zero in on the people who moved down to the land of Nephi, the Nephites there, when Alma broke away from that group because of wicked King Noah, he had a line of authority and was able to baptize and do those types of things. And I think it's interesting to note that kind of was a case in the Book of Mormon times as well.
Mm-hmm. Also, in the Book of Mormon, when Jesus comes to visit the Nephites, he specifically gives them authority to baptize when he's at the temple. And so, those individuals there who receive that commission and that authority, their priesthood line of authority goes directly to the Savior. There's no unbroken chain there. He is the authority, and he gave it to them. And so, anyone that they then ordain or pass that authority on to would be able to link that all the way back to the Savior. It's
on that subject,
it's
Jason, I think it's
pretty
important
great.
to note the if you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you want to know what your priesthood line of authority is, and because you're not sure, you can contact church headquarters through their website, and ask for that, and they will gladly print it off and give it to you. I think that's
It's it's
wonderful.
actually it's actually provided in the Tools app as well. So
Perfect.
if you're a member of the church, active member, going to church and everything, you'll probably be familiar with the Tools app, because that brings up like your ward directory. It brings up your callings, who your ministering brothers and sisters are. Well, under you, you will have a little link on there. It says, priesthood line of authority. And so you can click on that and have that come right up. It's pretty cool, really interesting.
That's fantastic.
So
And it's neat to,
available at the touch of a button.
yeah, to see that go clear back to Jesus Christ. And it's important to understand that that is legitimate, and that you can see it firsthand through that line as it goes back. It's really neat.
Yeah. In keeping with that, Jacob and Esau are going to have kind of a dispute about who gets the blessing, the birthright, the priesthood through that line. Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob, his twin, came after him. What's interesting is that though it is typical for the birthright to go through the firstborn, we're going to see time and time and time again where that exception comes up. Um, Esau loses the birthright here under Jacob, to Jacob under Isaac. Well, Jacob's birthright should go to Reuben, his firstborn, but instead it goes to Joseph. Joseph's birthright should go to Manasseh, his firstborn, but it goes to Ephraim. And so we see exceptions to this rule in this family time and time again, and it's really interesting as to why. But this is kind of the first break in that tradition of everything going to the firstborn. Um, Esau, the name means red. We see the fact that he's called a red man, probably a hairy man as well. Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of what is directly translated as red stuff, probably red lentils or something. Later, the posterity of Esau are called the Edomites. Esau and Edom are the same word, and they live in a place called Idumea. Same word. It also means red, and they're cattle ranchers. And so every time that they go to butcher cattle, the ground runs red with blood. It becomes an end time type of slaughter over in the Middle East. And Christ is said to come from Idumea and wear crimson or red garments when he comes to rescue Israel in the end time. And so there's a lot of imagery around Esau, all having to do with red. And it's really kind of hammered in there. If you were writing a book and you weren't very creative, you would keep putting red to describe everything. He wore a red hat, and he put on his red coat, and he wore red shoes, just over and over again. Jacob is an interesting name. It means heel, or one who supplants. So if you recall the birth scene with Esau and Jacob, Esau is coming out, and Jacob supposedly reaches out and grabs onto Esau's heel. And so there's kind of a play on words there. Jacob's name probably was Yaakov, which means heel grabber. but later on, there's some etymology that might make it sound like he was crooked or deceitful, in the way that he later steals the birthright from Esau. But originally, the name Jacob was probably something like God protects or God follows after. And just throughout the storytelling has taken on kind of a deceitful tone when he steals the birthright from Esau. And the way that happens, I think we know the story that Esau was out hunting. He was hungry, and he came back and sold his birthright for something that had zero value. And Esau, and later on Edom and Idumea, and the people that descend from Esau, is a type for apostates, for people who have had or who deserve the birthright, but who give it up. If we look at the first verse that mentions Esau, it's Genesis 25:27. It said, "And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents." We'll get to the imagery here of Jacob in a minute, but this tells us quite a bit about Esau. Esau is a cunning hunter. So far in the narrative, there have only been two people that have been named as hunters, and that was Nimrod, who is a type of an antichrist, and Esau. There's a reason for that. Esau is a man of the field, a farmer. He raised crops. The only other person so far mentioned in the narrative that was also a man of the field was Cain. And Cain was shown in stark contrast to Abel, who tended flocks, and Esau is compared here to Jacob, who watches over the flocks. So the narrative is comparing Esau to both Cain and Nimrod, and setting him up as not a very good guy, at least not a covenant person, and what we'll see later is one who holds zero value to his covenants. And so he trades his birthright for what we come to know as a mess of pottage, basically a bowl of beans. And when he realizes what he's done and what Jacob is essentially taking from him, because honestly, Isaac was incredibly wealthy. We learn that Abraham walked out of Egypt with a king's ransom. Pharaoh put enough gifts on Abraham to make him almost as wealthy as Pharaoh himself. And the narrative tells us that Isaac received all of that, and he increased it 100-fold. So he's incredibly wealthy. And Esau, maybe knowing what he was doing, maybe not, trades that away to Jacob. And he's angry about it. And so what does he do? He plots to murder Jacob. This, just like Cain and Abel, is not a crime of passion. It's not like he was embarrassed and in a fit of rage he struck out at Jacob. He's plotting this. And not only is he plotting it, but he's saying that once Isaac dies and the mourning is done, the time of mourning, he's then going to kill Jacob. And so he's plotting this premeditated murder of both his father and his brother. And he's not a good person. You don't just have that in your heart as happenstance. And so this type of him goes down through the end time. Esau is someone who could have had everything but traded away for nothing. Edom represents Babylon of the world, or Idumea. We read in D&C 136 that it's synonymous. And so his type, the people that come down through him are those who have taken on covenants, who have at least some semblance of what's going on, and they just give it up. They don't care. They would rather have the riches and wealth of the world. They'd rather have anything but whatever the covenant path offers.
Jason, what are your thoughts in biblical language and throughout the Bible, and also throughout the Book of Mormon? We have genealogies, very important, and it's a prominent part of the narrative through these scriptures, genealogy. And in the Old Testament especially, we get a lot of the genealogy, actual lineage spoken and talked about. When we talk about Jacob and Esau, what are your thoughts on today's uh, narrative that perhaps would connect in and go clear back to those biblical times um, through the different branches of families? Do we see anything today that would be a reflection of those lineages, and how does it play out? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. It's hard to say, especially like, when we talk of patriarchal blessings or something like that, when we're either identified with a tribe of Israel or adopted into a tribe of Israel. That's all through Jacob. And we talk about all the descendants of Abraham. We're really only familiar with the ones that have come down through Jacob. Esau, as the narrative eventually shows, pretty much did inherit all of Isaac's wealth, and he became a prince, and he had his own, posterity that still linked back to Abraham. Um, you know, I don't know. It's hard to show any kind of a direct genealogical link that we might point to, but the types of people, we certainly can, and it's what you might, if we were talking strictly of members of the church, people who have, made covenants and then just abandoned them. It's fair weather Mormons. It's those who are members of the church in name only. They've been baptized. They might have even gone on a mission, but they no longer keep the Sabbath day holy. They don't care too much about the word of wisdom. They don't pay attention to conference when it comes out. If the prophet says something or makes a recommendation, they couldn't care less. It's just people who though they are under covenant, really couldn't care less, and just go throughout life worrying more about the things of the world, about pleasures, about power and popularity and stuff like that. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of that right now. Um,
I
and
wonder,
we'll probably see more of it as things get harder to be a covenant keeper.
yeah, I think that's a good thought. I really enjoy comparing those thoughts and that discussion that we find in the Old Testament, especially with some of the information that comes out in the Book of Mormon, and kind of put those two periods of time side by side, especially in Third Nephi, where we talk about those who will inherit the land, when Christ was talking to them and saying that the remnant of the seed of Jacob would come at a period of time and inherit that part of the land. And
Mhm.
so you see covenant people, and specifically the remnant of the seed of Jacob and the seed of Joseph, and that it talks about that, or the seed of the people of Abraham. And so you have that, and you have the lands of inheritance. And we know that there are specific places throughout the world that are designated as lands of inheritance, the U.S. being one, the land in and around Israel and that part of the world as a land of inheritance. And I'm sure there are others. But I just find it interesting to bring that up and discuss it, especially when it talks about things that will happen during our latter days. And perhaps we're seeing some of these things.
Yeah, and there are some people who President Nelson put it as living below their privileges. You know, these lands are promised as an inheritance. There are other things that are promised to those covenant keepers, and there's a lot of people who unfortunately don't care too much about that. They really couldn't care less about keeping their covenants and receiving those inheritances. But the scriptures are full of promises, and the people like Esau just don't care. Um, I though he's kind of lumped in with Cain and Nimrod here in the narrative. I don't know that these people are perdition, because they haven't necessarily ascended to such high spiritual level that they've met with the Lord face to face as Abraham did, um, and so I don't know that they've lost that high as some people have, but they're also not trying to reach high. They're not aspiring to that at all. Um, and unfortunately, like I said, I think there's a good portion of us that might fall into that group that
Absolutely.
President Nelson was trying to really encourage with exact obedience, as he said in the covenant path.
I think it's worthy to mention as well that those who are baptized uh, into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are automatically grafted or into the branch of Israel and become literal descendants of Israel. And that's an important, when we're talking about having this discussion, that's an important thing to remember, because suddenly you're in that group of covenant people, and you become a literal descendant of Israel, which is wonderful, and all the blessings associated with that.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, as an opposite of Esau, we have Jacob. And so in that same verse, we see, as the boys grew, Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. Well, the statement of Jacob being a plain man is interesting. I'll get to that in a minute, but it tells us that Jacob worships the Lord in the temple. He makes and keeps covenants with the Lord. Dwelling in a tent is not to say that they live in tents as opposed to houses. That has nothing to do with their domicile, but this is a symbolic literary device that tells us that the person makes and keeps covenants. Um, so if we go back to Abraham 2, we see that Abraham is described as dwelling in a tent. It says, "And I took Sarai, whom I took to wife, and came forth in the way of the land of Canaan, and dwelt in tents as we came on our way. Therefore eternity was our covering, and our rock, and our salvation as we journeyed. Now I, Abraham, built an altar in the land of Jershon, and made an offering unto the Lord." So in just those couple verses, we see that Abraham and Sarah dwelt in tents. Eternity was their covering, and their rock and their salvation. These are all metaphors for the presence of the Lord among them. Abraham built an altar. This is all temple imagery. And so that passage is setting them up as temple builders and as covenant keepers. And if you'll recall how Abraham and Sarah received temple covenants and blessings while they were in the door of their tents. This is all temple symbolism. So if we look back at that same verse where it says that Jacob dwelt in tents, it's silent about where Esau dwells, though he surely lived in the same house or tent or covering as Jacob, but the narrative doesn't say that he dwelt in a tent, because it's not trying to tell us what they slept under. It's trying to tell us that Jacob is a covenant keeper and worships the Lord in a temple situation. This carries over to the New World with Nephi and Lehi. If you'll recall that Nephi continually says that, "And my father dwelt in a tent." Some of the shortest verses that we like to read in seminary in the morning so that we can get on with the day. He says it 4 times. So this is not Nephi reminding us that they used to live in a nice house in Jerusalem and are now living in humble tents. This is Nephi telling us that Lehi is a legitimate prophet, making and keeping temple covenants with the Lord while they're out in the wilderness. And Lehi receives covenant blessings at the door of his tent, just like Abraham and Sarah did. He gets the Liahona that way. And so in that short little passage, where we're learning that Jacob is a covenant keeper and Esau is not. And that's how the narrative sets these both up. And so if we get to the identification of Jacob as a plain man, it doesn't mean that he's simple. It doesn't mean that he, likes to eat lentils instead of, roasted meats or anything like that. The Hebrew word is tam, and this has some connotations with what we would normally associate with plain. So one of the definitions is perfect, complete, one who lacks nothing in physical strength, beauty, etc., sound, wholesome, ordinary, quiet, complete, morally innocent, having integrity, one who is morally and ethically pure. So it's got all of these different connotations with just that word plain. And so if you were to apply each of those to Jacob, you would get the idea of what kind of a person he really was. So again, it sets him up as a covenant keeper like his father, like Abraham, and like I said, the first word there, perfect. There's very few people who are identified as perfect in the scriptures, but that word tam, plain, has the connotation of being perfect in that covenant keeping sense.
That's fantastic to note. I especially like that covenant language where we talk about dwelling in a tent. And perhaps we could think about how that applies to us and its relationship to temple covenant keeping and so forth. And the connotation that leads back to the fact that these are true prophets dwelling in tents, and thinking about how that applies through the language. And I love the fact that we can pull that information out of the scriptures and expand our understanding by just reading and seeing how the language applies to covenant keeping in this specific example.
And we do somewhat of the same thing too. We have certain designators that we apply to ourselves and to others that have connotations like that. Like if, for instance, RM, return missionary. If you're a bunch of friends sitting around talking and somebody says, "Hey, I met this really great guy. We're going out, and I think he might be the one." Somebody's like, "Oh, is he an RM?" Though it really has no weight behind it, we've assigned a weight to it. We've assigned the fact that somebody has gone on a mission and come back, that they must be a good person, or they must be worthy of something like that. And we all know that simply having gone on a mission does not really mean anything about somebody's character. There have been a lot of very, bad people that have come back and can claim the RM title. But that's kind of what the narrative does here. It takes one of those identifiers and puts it on these people, and we're just supposed to understand that. We might also say, a recommend holder. If you're talking about somebody, it's like, hey, are they a recommend holder? Well, again, it's assigning a weight of importance to that, identifying that person with should be a temple attender and a covenant keeper and something like that. And in a perfect world, holding a recommend would mean that. But we know that there are, again, some very bad people that have held temple recommends, and that doesn't indicate that necessarily. But, we still do that. We assign some of these things to each other, just like they do in the narrative here.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up the thought, how will it be, and let's just play pretend for a few minutes, how will it be if we if we take some writings from today and they somehow get transposed into scripture, And 500 years from now, they're used on as some religious canon. What kinds of language will they be talking about then? And perhaps some of those phrases and terminology you just used, Jason, would come up in that language. I think it's kind of fun to think about things like that.
Oh yeah, and you see that in conference all the time. A buzzword will come up, and all of a sudden it starts getting used and applied everywhere. The covenant path, or let God prevail, or hear Him. All these different things that, taken at face value, don't mean a whole lot, but we have put a lot of meaning behind them. And there could be infinite discussions about what they mean and how to apply them and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, if you were 500 years from now reading, President Nelson's talk about hear Him or let God prevail, well, you might skip over some of that. It might just go right over your head. But to those of us who lived in it and have experienced it and have gone through it so many times, it means much more to us. And so, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how language works and what is passed down through the ages and what's actually conveyed on paper or plates or however the
Yeah.
medium might be.
And to that point, I have to say, just the phrase covenant path is a relatively new phrase used in talks and some of our church doctrines and writings, because 30 or 35 years ago, we didn't hear that phrase very often. And in
And it's
fact,
not found in the scriptures. If you look covenant path in the scriptures, it's not there. And so this is what somebody has understood what was in the scriptures and has turned it into what we can understand in our own language.
yeah, and I think it's so important that our church leaders especially have recognized this is something that we need to focus on. And I must say as well, in a lot of our talks and writings that come down to trickle down through from church headquarters, you might say, the discussions on Jesus Christ have grown and expanded as well. So we hear Jesus Christ, covenant path, covenant keeping. Some of those things are spoken of and used so much more. And I'm so happy to see that, because I think that that's where we need to focus our attention.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, well, I think the last thing we can talk about is kind of how the birthright got taken from Esau and was given to Jacob. Um, and it sets it up as a pretty big deception on the part of Rebekah and Jacob, because they dress up Jacob as Esau in order to get the birthright from Isaac. Um, I mean, the narrative sets it up as a huge deception. You can't really get around that. And the birthright is given to Jacob. Isaac, when he realizes it, says, "Hey, I can't take it back. The Lord's given it to Jacob." We kind of have to reconcile these things with us. Did Jacob really deceive a prophet of God? Was Rebekah, backstabbing in such a way? I don't know. The narrative sets it up this way, and we have to just reconcile how some of these things play out with our own sense of morality and rightness. But I'll just say here that Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob are all incredibly righteous people, approaching Abraham and Sarah with their faithfulness to covenants. I mentioned before that Isaac and Rebekah are incredibly wealthy. Abraham was hugely rich and gave Isaac everything he had, and the narrative says that Isaac multiplied it 100-fold. Whether that's literary device or whether it's literal, I don't know, but Isaac is incredibly wealthy. they're also very powerful and influential. They took over. Abraham and Sarah had this huge band of Zion communities that they had organized all over the area, and Isaac and Rebekah took that over. And with their wealth and power, they're ruling essentially as a king and a queen over their Zion community, where Abraham and Sarah were over people of like 1,000 or so. That's just grown, and it's gone, into a small kingdom, if you will. And they don't keep things from each other. Isaac and Rebekah tell each other everything, and so Rebekah was visited by the Lord while she was pregnant and told that she had twins, and was told of the struggle of the twins inside of her, and that the younger would rule over the elder. She didn't keep that a secret. Isaac knew about this too. And when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of pottage, everybody knew about it. It was not some little exchange between the two of them. Everybody knew what Esau had done. This was not a secret. And so everybody knew that he had passed on the birthright, and Jacob was now the guy. The fact that Esau still expected something from Isaac showed that he was, again, not paying much attention to it, or thought that it wasn't that important, that his passing on the birthright would just kind of be overlooked, and he still got everything anyway. He wanted his cake and to eat it too. Esau was not keeping covenants with the Lord. He's been compared to both Nimrod and Cain. He then marries outside the covenant with a local woman who didn't know the Lord. And again, know is that covenant language, meaning she was not a covenant keeper. And it vexed Isaac and Rebekah greatly. So none of them are ignorant as to how this all builds up. And they really shouldn't be ignorant on how it plays out in the end with Jacob receiving the birthright, because it's kind of been talked about for a long time, and Esau made it official. But it's going to play out that way anyway. One interesting point is in Genesis 27, the way it starts out is it said, "And it came to pass that when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, that he could not see." He may have been literally blind. In fact, the narrative kind of paints it that way. But it is also more to the fact that he's dying and needs to pass on his prophetic mantle to somebody. So you'll see throughout the scriptures where a prophet of God, they say it in such a way like he saw that he soon must go the way of all the earth. He saw that he would soon die, and then they pass on this blessing to their children, or this prophetic mantle. And that's what this is here. Eyes becoming dim is imagery referring to a prophet or a seer who no longer sees in the prophetic sense. So he has passed that mantle on to Jacob, because you always have a prophet among them, and one who sees. And so if Isaac is no longer the guy, then it's being passed to Jacob. We get the thing about Moses when he was 120 years old when he died, and Deuteronomy said his eye was not dim, meaning that though Moses was 120 years old, he was still the prophet, and he was still the seer for Israel, until they moved into the promised land, and he passed everything on to Aaron, and he took that over, and Moses was then translated and taken up to heaven. But throughout Moses's life there, his seership did not dim, and he was God's seer and prophet on earth. But Isaac is close to dying. His seership is waning. And so he calls his posterity to him to give them a blessing before dying. And it's going to go to Jacob. So I kind of see a similarity between what happens next and what is known as a scapegoat ritual later on in Israel. In the Bible, a scapegoat is one of two goat kids, a pair, sometimes twins. One goat would be sacrificed, and the other goat, the scapegoat, was released into the wilderness, taking with it all of the sins of the people. So the priest would place the sins of the people on this goat and release it out into the wilderness. and the other goat was sacrificed, and its blood atoned for those sins. Um, and so later on, we see that Aaron, again, Moses' brother, shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. So, for that scapegoat, atonement and deliverance, we need a pair of goat kids. We need covenant curses and blessings, and we need sacrifice and atonement. And we have all of those things here with this thing that Rebecca goes through. Rebecca calls for 2 goat kids. Jacob later fears a cursing will be on his head for this deception. Rebecca, like the Levitical priest, offers to take upon herself the curses. Jacob receives the blessing, but in the end is sent away into the wilderness to avoid being murdered by Esau. Esau receives the curses and says that he will live by the sword and serve his brother. So we have a lot of similarities between this kind of exchange with Jacob, Esau, Rebekah, and Isaac, and what Israel will later adopt as a very repetitive, it happens yearly, this scapegoat ritual that they go through. But in the end, Jacob receives the birthright and is sent off to save his life from Esau. And that's kind of where the narrative leaves us off right now.
Very interesting, Jason. As we were discussing this, I couldn't help but think a couple of things. One of them being, what would be the case throughout history if the situation between Jacob and Esau had not taken place regarding the birthright? And are there any other prominent families in any of the scriptures that the birthright situation was a case, but they weren't switched? And I'm thinking of Lehi's family, Laman, Lemuel, older brothers, Nephi, Sam, younger brothers. But it seems like the people split off, and the younger brothers were kind of represented, perhaps if you want to create or frame it this way, the righteous branch of Lehi's posterity, and then Laman and Lemuel represented the so-called unrighteous. But we must recognize that the so-called unrighteous branch were famous for sticking with their covenants and staying close to the church during times of posterity throughout those generations. That's important to note. And also, who was left when the communities had the final battle, and who was left? And so it's interesting as we discuss these various incidents through Scripture, families, and how the posterity acted and reacted to the gospel, and their throughout the generations. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. What would things have been like if Esau hadn't retained his birthright? I don't know, because he ends up inheriting all the wealth. Jacob gets sent off, and when he comes back years later, he meets Esau with his own private army of princes and stuff like that. Esau didn't miss out on any of Isaac and Rebekah's wealth. The only thing that he missed out on was the birthright blessing, and he didn't seem to care much about that at all. And so when Jacob comes back, they're pretty much reunified. There's not really any hard feelings there, because Esau got what he wanted in the end, and what Jacob got out of it, he really didn't care about to begin with. And so it kind of turns out okay for both of them. But boy, that whole birthright thing is something curious, because from Adam, it's often not the firstborn. It came down. They had so many children before they got to Cain and Abel, and then eventually the birthright goes to Seth. So we've gone generations and decades of kids before the birthright is given to a righteous son with Seth. And then you see, the firstborn with Noah, and then it comes down to Abraham. We don't know if Abraham was the firstborn, but everything is kind of reset with him. And we see, that Ishmael was his firstborn. And, then Isaac comes along and receives a birthright. Jacob is not the firstborn, but he gets the birthright. Joseph is not the firstborn, but he gets it. Same with Ephraim. It's almost a pattern of breaking this tradition of where the birthright goes down through. Honestly, I don't think that it matters who has the birthright, as long as it's the righteous individual and the one who is keeping covenants with the Lord that is able to pass that tradition of covenant keeping on. Like you said, the covenant keeping among the Lamanites is famous. That they had covenants among themselves, and even had some of the patterns of that Near Eastern emperor vassal covenant stuff that we had talked about, with Lamoni and his father, the king of all the Lamanites, so that when they actually join the church and start keeping covenant with Christ, they are solid. They have a history of keeping covenants anyway, and they take it seriously. And when it comes to like the people of Ammon who bury their weapons of war and covenant not to lift them up again, they're tempted. They're tried with, hey, you guys are going to die if you don't lift your sword. And they're like, well, then we die. We're going to keep these covenants, and that's more important to us than our physical lives. And so we see that even when Jesus comes among the Nephites, a lot of righteous Lamanites were among them, and it's those Lamanites that always kept covenant, and the covenant was with the Lamanites that they would always be preserved on the land. That when the end time comes, that when the New Jerusalem is to be built, it will be that remnant of the Lamanites that builds the New Jerusalem, and they keep those covenant blessings going throughout this entire time.
That's such a wonderful thing to think about. And it's interesting to take note of those things. Perhaps as we wrap up here, Jason, if we could get feedback from any of our listeners to maybe chime in with a note in the comments or somewhere like that, to note if your family or you personally have been affected in any way by the system of birthrights. I have been. My ancestors from Western Europe came to the United States in the 1600s because they did not have the birthright. The oldest son got that. And my family came from I think the second son in the family, who got no birthright. So he had nothing. He didn't inherit anything. And he came to the New World to make a new life for his family. And that's how my Hicks ancestors got to the New World. They came in about the late 1600s for that reason.
Yeah, that's really cool. I honestly couldn't tell you about mine. I'll have to look that up.
It's kind of fascinating when you think about it, because that has been a custom, a tradition in a lot of cultures throughout history, and it's very biblical. And that particular thing stretches, we don't see it much anymore, at least in the U.S. culture. But I think there's a few countries throughout the world, and maybe specific to families, that would hold to that tradition of birthrights.
That's interesting. I'll say this, that when it came time to receive the Melchizedek priesthood, traditionally I would have had my dad ordain me to that. But at the time, he said he felt impressed to have somebody else do that. And so my bishop at the time ordained me to the Melchizedek priesthood and to the office of an elder. And so my priesthood line of authority goes through him and his father and through their line. So though I have a genealogical line, it is different than my priesthood line, and it's kind of interesting that way.
Thanks for listening to Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. This show was produced by Voice Right Media. Any reproductions or copying of any content of this show are strictly prohibited without the written consent of the owners.